4 winters of silence. 4 years in which a small town lived haunted by a mystery with no answers. 2 little girls vanished without a trace, and every Christmas since had been marked by grief and absence. But what no one expected was that the key to this puzzle wouldn't be found in police files or forgotten clues, but in the instinct of a dog. In Whisker Tales, you'll discover how the loyalty and courage of a German Shepherd forever changed the fate of a town, and unearthed secrets buried in the most unexpected place. 2 girls had been missing for 4 years, until a police dog barked at the old basement next door. The mystery that had consumed a quiet community was about to unravel in the most unexpected way. No one imagined the answer had been so close all along. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Snow fell gently over Cedar Hollow, Wisconsin, as Grace Walker trudged down the frozen sidewalk. At 58, she felt every year twice over that December morning, especially with the biting wind slicing through her worn-out coat. The retired detective glanced at the Christmas decorations beginning to appear on porches, a painful contrast to the emptiness she carried inside. Just 2 weeks remained until her official retirement, but Grace felt no relief. The disappearance of Emma and Lily Carter, twin sisters who vanished on Christmas Eve 4 years ago, still haunted her like a ghost refusing to rest. 4 winters had passed since the girls, just 7 years old, disappeared without a trace. 4 years of false leads, shattered hopes, and dead ends. "Let's go, Ranger," she murmured to the German Shepherd walking faithfully beside her. The dog, with a prominent scar along his right flank, was more than a companion. He was a survivor, just like her. Rescued after serving in the military, Ranger carried invisible wounds that only Grace seemed to understand. She stopped in front of the old Methodist church, now abandoned, letting her mind drift through the details of the case. The girls had last been seen playing in the backyard of the Carter home. No witnesses, no solid evidence, just 2 empty chairs at Beth Carter's dinner table, chairs she refused to remove, unwilling to accept that her daughters might never return. Back home, Grace followed her meticulous routine, brewed strong coffee, fed Ranger, and sat at the kitchen table, where the case files remained spread out like a battlefield. Sheriff Tom Bradley had all but shelved the investigation, more concerned with budget cuts and the town's reputation. "We need to move on," he'd said. Words that felt like betrayal to Grace. Night fell quickly, as it always did in Wisconsin winters. While eating reheated chicken noodle soup, Grace watched Ranger lying beside the space heater. Both bore scars, his visible on the body, hers buried deep in the soul. The loss of her own daughter years ago had made her relentless, maybe even obsessed with the Carter case. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the images that haunted her. The smiling faces on missing posters, Beth's hollow stare, the fruitless searches through the woods. Tomorrow would be another unofficial day of investigation, another chance to find answers before she turned in her badge for good. Suddenly, Ranger lifted his head, sensing her unease. His eyes locked onto hers in a silent exchange that needed no words. In that modest home, 2 wounded souls found comfort in each other, bound by instinct and the kind of pain only survivors understand. The icy wind whipped across Grace's face as she walked with Ranger through the deep snow. It was a December morning, like so many others in Cedar Hollow, cold, quiet, and heavy with memory. Even in retirement, Grace kept up her volunteer patrols, still driven by the case that refused to let her go. Ranger trotted a few steps ahead, his dark coat stark against the white landscape. Normally disciplined and methodical, his movements followed a familiar rhythm Grace knew by heart. So when he stopped abruptly in front of the ruins of the old church, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Ranger, come on," she called, adjusting her scarf. But the dog didn't move. His ears stood tall, his body tense. Then, without warning, Ranger began digging furiously into the snow piled beside the church's crumbling basement. His barks echoed down the empty street, shattering the silence. Grace had never seen him act like this. There was urgency in his movements, as if something vital lay buried beneath the frost. "What is it, boy?" she asked, approaching cautiously. As she knelt beside him, something pink emerged from the snow. Her heart raced. With trembling fingers, she cleared the area around the object, revealing a small child's glove. A pink glove, perfectly preserved by the cold, as if it had been lost just yesterday, not 4 years ago. Grace felt the breath leave her lungs. The glove matched exactly what Emma and Lily Carter had worn that Christmas Eve. Beth had described them countless times, pink with embroidered snowflakes, during her endless interviews after the girls vanished. Ranger sniffed the glove intensely, letting out a low whimper. He seemed to understand the weight of the discovery. "Good job," Grace whispered, stroking his head as she carefully sealed the glove in a plastic evidence bag. Something inside her, something that had gone dormant after years of failure, sparked to life in that moment. A flame the sheriff and the rest of Cedar Hollow had tried to extinguish, with speeches about moving on and accepting loss. Grace Walker stared at the abandoned church, its crumbling basement partially exposed beneath the snow. Beside her, Ranger stood alert, ears high, body tense, waiting for her to understand. And she did. Emma and Lily Carter might still be alive. The case that had defined and nearly destroyed her career had just opened a new chapter. She marched into the sheriff's office, pink glove in hand, heart pounding. This changes everything, she thought. But Sheriff Tom Bradley didn't share her urgency. "A glove? That's what you've got, Grace?" he said, shaking his head as he shuffled papers on his desk. "Kids have played around that church for years. It could belong to anyone." Grace's stomach dropped. "It's not just any glove, Tom. It's identical to the ones Beth Carter bought for the girls that Christmas. It's pristine, like it was buried right after they vanished." Tom sighed deeply, rubbing his tired face. He gestured toward a stack of budget reports. "Look at this. Staff cuts, pressure from City Hall, and the mayor breathing down my neck to clean up Cedar Hollow's image. You know what he told me yesterday? We need to stop being the town of the missing twins." Grace said nothing as Tom continued, voice low. 4 years, Grace. 4 years without a single solid lead. I can't reopen a case over a glove found by a dog." "Ranger isn't just a dog," she snapped, blood boiling. "He's trained for search and rescue. If he zeroed in on that spot, there's a reason." Tom handed the glove back, avoiding her eyes. "Cedar Hollow needs to move on. Beth needs to move on. And so do you." Outside, the wind cut across Grace's face like a blade. Ranger waited patiently by the patrol car, his breath forming soft clouds in the frigid air. As she approached, he tilted his head, as if asking how it went. "It's just us now, partner," she murmured, stroking his scarred head. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by case photos, incident reports, and a map of the town. Retirement was 2 weeks away, and her pension depended on a clean record. Investigating on her own meant risking everything. She glanced at Ranger, curled up beside the heater. His scars, remnants of his time in the military, glowed faintly under the amber light. He'd survived the worst and still trusted his instincts. "If you say there's something in that basement," she whispered, pulling her old badge from the drawer, "then let's find out what it is." Later that evening, Grace knocked on the door of a small log cabin on Maple Street. The wind stung her cheeks as she waited. After a moment, Dorothy Henderson opened the door, her pale blue eyes framed by deep wrinkles. "I thought you'd hung up that badge for good," Dorothy said, ushering her inside. The modest home smelled of cinnamon and old books. Dorothy poured tea into chipped porcelain cups while Ranger settled quietly by the fireplace. "I never told anyone this," the elderly woman began, adjusting her glasses. "I thought it was just grief talking." After his granddaughter died, Pastor Bill started acting strange. Grace leaned in, listening closely. Dorothy had lived next to the old Methodist church for over 40 years. Her kitchen window had a direct view of the side entrance. "He'd show up at odd hours, always after 10 at night," she said, "carrying large bags, never empty." Dorothy stood slowly, using her cane for support, and retrieved a worn notebook from a drawer. "I started keeping track. Thought maybe he was stealing donations or something." She handed the notebook to Grace. 3 nights before the girls disappeared, Bill had made 5 separate trips. 5. Grace flipped through the yellowed pages. Dorothy had logged dates, times, and brief descriptions with meticulous care. Without realizing it, she'd created a valuable record of the pastor's suspicious routine. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" Grace asked. Dorothy lowered her gaze, guilt etched across her face. "Who would have believed me? Bill was respected. I was just a nosy old woman. Besides, he started bringing me soup and bread after Emma died. Said God told him to care for the lonely." She led Grace to the window and pointed to a nearly invisible path through the bushes behind the church. "He never used the front door, always this way, and he'd come back lighter, like he'd left something behind." Ranger sniffed the air toward the window, ears twitching. Grace felt a chill crawl down her spine. Dorothy's notes might be the first concrete link between Bill Thornton and the disappearance of the Carter twins. "I'm ready to tell everything I know," Dorothy said firmly. "I've carried this secret long enough." Ranger's nose worked furiously among the rubble, his movements sharp and deliberate. Grace watched, trusting his trained instincts. When he began digging with urgency, her heart raced. Clearing away rotted wood and broken concrete, she uncovered what Ranger had already sensed, a heavy wooden door, expertly concealed beneath the church's old foundation. "Good job, boy," she whispered, stroking his scarred head as she examined the find. The door was surprisingly well maintained, its hinges freshly oiled, a clear sign of recent use. Grace hesitated, feeling the weight of an unauthorized investigation pressing down on her shoulders. Tom Bradley would surely reprimand her for this, but Grace was long past caring about protocol. She pulled the door open. A wave of damp earth and isolation hit her nose. The air was thick with mold and something else. A human presence. A narrow wooden staircase descended into the darkness. Grace flicked on her flashlight and followed Ranger down the creaking wooden steps. Each one groaned beneath her boots, echoing into the darkness. What she found below made her stomach twist. It wasn't just a basement. It was a network of underground rooms, carefully constructed like a makeshift apartment. A faded couch sat in a corner. Shelves lined with canned food formed a crude kitchen. And, most disturbing of all, a children's bedroom with 2 small beds. "Oh my God!" Grace whispered, sweeping her light across the walls, which were covered in colorful drawings, children playing, a bearded man holding their hands, and scenes of a hostile outside world with fire and rain falling from the sky. Ranger sniffed every corner while Grace examined the toys scattered across the floor, handmade cloth dolls, wooden blocks, and children's books marked with stickers. Everything pointed to Emma and Lily Carter having lived here, but now the place was empty. In one corner, Grace found a small shelf of religious books. Nearby, a tiny table with 2 child-sized chairs and brightly colored plates. Bill Thornton had built an alternate home, a parallel world for the girls. He had kept them here, Grace realized, feeling a mix of horror and relief. Finally, she had concrete proof. "But where did he take them now?" she murmured. Ranger barked suddenly, drawing her attention to a side door she hadn't noticed. The dog seemed to know. They were only beginning to unravel the mystery. Grace took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever lay deeper in this underground refuge. The silence was unnerving, but her trained eyes picked up subtle signs of recent human presence. On a small makeshift table, she found a plate with soft breadcrumbs. Beside it, a bitten apple was beginning to brown. Someone had been here, maybe a day or two ago. Ranger sniffed anxiously, confirming her suspicion. He moved through the tight space, nose to the ground, scanning every corner. They left in a hurry. Grace muttered, spotting neatly folded children's clothes on a thin mattress. The sizes matched what Emma and Lily would be wearing now, 4 years after they vanished. Across the room, a handmade calendar caught her eye. Meticulous scribbles marked the days with strange symbols and codes, meaningless to anyone but the person who created them. The last marked day was exactly 3 days ago, the same day Ranger barked at the church ruins. A chill ran down Grace's spine. She'd been so close. Maybe her presence, along with Ranger's, had spooked Bill, forcing him to relocate. In a darker corner, Grace found a cardboard box filled with colorful notebooks. She opened one, and her heart clenched. They were children's diaries, written in shaky handwriting. Many pages were filled with drawings. A bearded old man, always depicted with a glowing halo, labeled Papa Bill. One day Papa Bill told us the flood took everyone up there. Read one trembling note. Only we survived because he saved us in the ark. Another page showed a simplified drawing of the outside world. Black clouds, lightning, people swept away by raging waters. Below, in a protected space, 3 smiling figures, a man and 2 girls. Grace sat on the cold floor, flipping through the diaries with damp fingers. He built an entire alternate reality for them, she whispered to Ranger, who gently pressed his nose into her hand. He turned a kidnapping into salvation. She photographed every page with her phone. These diaries weren't just evidence. They were the key to understanding the girls' mental state, maybe even the path to finding them. Surrounded by the remnants of a hidden life, her fingers brushed against a small teddy bear, worn from time and love. The toy, abandoned in haste, stirred a pain she'd kept locked away for years. "Sarah," she whispered into the silence. Her daughter's name rarely escaped her lips, as if saying it reopened a wound that never healed. Grace closed her eyes, remembering the angelic face of the little girl she lost to leukemia 7 years ago. The damp walls seemed to echo with laughter, some from Emma and Lily, others from her own memory. A photo taped to the wall showed the twins smiling, arms wrapped around Bill Thornton. The ex-pastor had built a world for the girls, just as Grace had tried to build one for Sarah in her final months, shielding her from the truth of her illness. The irony wasn't lost on her. Ranger, sensing the shift in his owner's emotions, approached quietly. He pressed his nose into her hand, just as he always did when he felt her sorrow. Grace stroked the scar along his side, a mark of his own battles and survival. "I'm chasing ghosts, aren't I?" she said, meeting his steady gaze. Maybe this case was never about Emma and Lily. Maybe it was always about Sarah. The realization hit her like a wave. Her obsession with the twins, disappearance, her refusal to close the case when everyone else had moved on, it had all been a way to outrun her own grief. If I can save Beth Carter's daughters, maybe it'll make up for not saving mine. Ranger lay beside her, sharing the weight of the silence. The dog, scarred by war and loss, seemed to understand human pain better than most. Grace leaned her head against the rough wall, letting a few tears fall. Among the scattered drawings, one stood out. 2 girls holding hands beneath a dark sky, protected by a tall figure. In the corner, in childish handwriting, it read, "Papa Bill saved us from the end of the world." Grace took a deep breath and wiped her tears. Ranger stood, alert once more. There was work to do. The girls were still out there, needing rescue not just from physical captivity, but from the twisted reality Bill had built around them. "Let's go, boy," Grace said, rising with renewed resolve. "We've got 2 girls to find." The dim glow of a desk lamp lit Grace Walker's modest living room as she spread the children's journals across the coffee table. Ranger slept at her feet, occasionally lifting his head whenever she sighed or muttered under her breath. The retired detective poured herself another cup of strong coffee, determined not to sleep until she could make sense of the pages before her. The notebooks were filled with colorful drawings and uneven handwriting. Grace noticed that Emma's writing was more structured, while Lily used brighter colors and bolder strokes. Both described the underground world as a sanctuary from a great flood, one that Pastor Bill Thornton had convinced them had destroyed everything above. Around 3 a.m., Grace found something that made her blood run cold. Across several pages, the girls had drawn a large dog they called the Guardian. He had a scar on his left flank and a torn ear, exactly like Ranger. A chill ran down her spine. How could they have drawn him so accurately? He didn't arrive in Cedar Hollow until 2 years after they disappeared, she whispered, stroking Ranger's head as he watched her with quiet focus. The only explanation was that Bill had occasionally allowed Emma and Lily out of the hideout, perhaps at night, to observe the world they'd been told no longer existed. During those outings, they must have seen Ranger. In one diary, Lily had written, "The Guardian watches over us when Daddy Bill sleeps. He stays outside, but he knows we're here." Grace felt tears sting her tired eyes. Without even knowing it, her canine partner had formed a connection with the missing girls. Beth Carter needed to see this. Her daughter's notes could help child psychologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell understand their mental state when they were found. But more importantly, the journals confirmed that Bill allowed controlled outings, which meant the girls could be anywhere in Cedar Hollow. Grace closed the final notebook and glanced at the clock. Nearly 5 a.m. She hadn't slept, but she felt more awake than ever. Ranger stood, sensing the rising urgency in his owner. Somehow, he knew he was part of this puzzle. "We're going to find them, partner," Grace whispered, placing her hand on his scar. "You already know. Now we just have to figure out where they are." Hours later, Grace was combing through old municipal records at Cedar Hollow's town hall. Ranger lay quietly at her feet as she flipped through archives until she found what she was looking for. A small obituary in the local paper, dated 3 weeks before the Carter twins vanished. Emma Thornton, age 7, beloved granddaughter of Pastor Bill Thornton, had died tragically from complications related to pneumonia. Another chill ran down Grace's spine. The pieces were beginning to fit. Emma had been the same age as Emma and Lily. Grace snapped a photo of the obituary and kept digging. After Emma's death, Bill had begun missing church services. Dorothy Henderson confirmed the shift when Grace visited her that afternoon. The elderly woman served tea in chipped porcelain cups as she recalled those dark days. "Bill was never the same after Emma passed," she said, adjusting her glasses. "He started talking about signs of the apocalypse, about saving children. We thought it was just grief. No one wanted to challenge him." Church records showed that Bill had requested a temporary leave, citing health issues. But witnesses had seen him buying large quantities of food and construction supplies. "He turned the church basement into something like a bunker," Dorothy explained, her voice trembling. "Said he was preparing a refuge for when the flood came again." Grace flipped through sermon notes found in Bill's abandoned office. In the margins, obsessive scribbles spoke of innocent souls needing salvation and a corrupt world that would be washed away. His personal tragedy had twisted his faith into something unrecognizable. What disturbed Grace most was how the Lutheran community had ignored the warning signs. The church council, afraid of scandal, quietly pushed Bill aside without ever questioning his increasingly erratic behavior. "We all wanted to protect his reputation," Sheriff Tom Bradley admitted when Grace confronted him with the evidence. He looked genuinely shaken. "Bill served this town for 30 years. No one imagined he could abduct 2 children, Grace replied, her voice heavy with accusation. Ranger, sensing the tension, pressed against her leg. Grace stroked his head, deep in thought. Grief didn't excuse Bill's actions, but it explained his distorted motivation. In his fractured mind, he hadn't kidnapped Emma and Lily. He believed he was saving them from a world he saw as doomed. Grace tucked the evidence into her folder. The case was no longer just about finding the girls. It was about understanding the broken mind that had taken them. That icy morning, Grace pulled up in front of Bill Thornton's modest home. Snowflakes whipped across the roof, piling up in quiet drifts. Ranger stood alert beside her, sensing something was off. The front door was unlocked, a clear sign something was wrong. Inside, Grace found a scene that was unsettling in its precision. Dishes stacked neatly in the kitchen, clothes folded with care on the bed, the house spotless. It wasn't the aftermath of a hasty escape. It was the footprint of a carefully planned disappearance. In the fireplace, the ashes were still warm, evidence that documents had been burned recently. Pastor Bill Thornton had destroyed something, leaving behind only charred fragments that escaped the flames. Grace Walker carefully collected the remains with gloved hands, hoping they might reveal something useful. In a half-open drawer, she found what looked like a personal journal. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, bills detailing escape routes, hidden locations, and repeated references to a flood and the salvation of innocents. There were even crude maps of the limestone caves near the quarry outside Cedar Hollow. "He's been planning this for years," Grace murmured as Ranger sniffed the corners of the house with growing urgency. An hour later, Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived with backup. Visibly shaken, he examined the evidence and finally accepted what Grace had been trying to prove. "I'm declaring Bill Thornton officially a fugitive," he announced to the officers. "I want roadblocks and searches at every possible hideout." The news spread through town like wildfire. Neighbors gathered outside the house, stunned. Dorothy Henderson cried quietly, blaming herself for not speaking up sooner about the pastor's strange behavior. "How did we miss this?" asked a woman in the crowd. "He prayed with our kids every Sunday." Grace watched the collective reaction, shock turning into anger, then fear. Cedar Hollow had always been a town that protected its own. Now it had to face the possibility that one of its most respected figures was behind the disappearance of the Carter twins. While the forensic team combed through the house, Grace made the call to Beth Carter. The girl's mother deserved to know that after 4 long years, there was finally a real suspect and a real chance of finding her daughters. Beth's home was a shrine frozen in time. Every day she set the dinner table for 5. 2 of the plates were small, colorful, decorated with faded princess designs. No one dared comment on the ritual, not even visitors who stumbled into the quiet heartbreak of that scene. Beth had never accepted comfort. When neighbors and friends urged her to move on, she would only smile, a hollow smile that never reached her eyes, and continue folding tiny pink and purple pajamas as if her daughters might wear them that very night. "My girls are coming back," she'd say with a conviction that unsettled even the most skeptical. "They'll need everything just as they left it." Grace watched this routine with a mix of admiration and concern. She recognized in Beth the same stubbornness that had kept her from shelving the case. When Grace knocked on Beth's door after finding the pink glove, she was met with suspicion. "You're just like the rest," Beth murmured, holding the door half open. "You pretend to care, but deep down, you've already given up." "I haven't," Grace replied, holding up the glove in a sealed evidence bag. "And neither has Ranger." Beth's eyes widened. Her hands trembled as she touched the plastic, as if she could feel her daughter's warmth through it. "Emma," she whispered. "That's Emma's." In the days that followed, an unlikely alliance formed. Beth began sharing details she'd never mentioned in official reports. How Emma was terrified of thunderstorms while Lily loved them. How they spoke fondly of a kind man from church who always gave them candy after services. Bill Thornton, Beth said one afternoon, showing Grace old photo albums. The girls adored him. He used to say children were angels on earth. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small children's book about Noah's Ark. Bill gave them this weeks before they disappeared. He talked a lot about saving the innocent from the flood. Grace felt a chill crawl down her spine. The pieces were falling into place. While the town moved on, resigned to tragedy, two women broken by loss were now united. Distrustful of each other, but determined to find answers everyone else had stopped looking for. News of the Carter twins, possible location, and Bill Thornton's escape spread like wildfire. Within 48 hours, quiet Cedar Hollow became the epicenter of national media coverage. News vans lined the town square, and reporters from Milwaukee, Chicago, and even New York set up camp outside the sheriff's office. Grace watched the chaos with discomfort. She'd never liked the spotlight, and now she was surrounded by microphones and cameras at every turn. Ranger stayed close, growling softly whenever a reporter got too close. "Detective Walker, is it true the department ignored evidence for 4 years?" asked a polished reporter, thrusting a mic toward her as she tried to enter the station. The pressure wasn't just from the press. Sheriff Bradley called an emergency meeting with the town council. He looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. "We need a coordinated public statement," he said, avoiding Grace's eyes. "This town can't be seen as complicit in a kidnapping." Longtime residents who once crossed the street to avoid Beth Carter and her endless grief now scrambled for interview slots, claiming they'd always suspected something was off about the pastor. Dorothy Henderson, the only one who had truly helped, refused to speak to journalists, choosing the quiet of her home instead. On the third night of non-stop coverage, Grace found Beth sitting alone on a bench in the town square, watching the media circus unfold. "They never asked about my girls," Beth said, her voice distant. "For 4 years, no one wanted to know what their laughter sounded like, or how they talked. Now all anyone cares about is whether they wore pink or blue." Grace Walker sat beside Beth Carter on the cold bench, Ranger curled at her feet. The weight of her looming retirement and the pressure to solve the case before handing in her badge made every hour feel heavier. "We're going to find your daughters," she promised, though she didn't voice the doubts gnawing at her about what condition the girls might be in after so long with Bill. That night, back home, Grace found an anonymous envelope in her mailbox. Inside was an old map of the limestone caves outside Cedar Hollow, with a red pencil mark circling one of the entrances. Ranger sniffed the paper and let out a single bark, as if something in the scent triggered a memory. The race against time had begun. Ranger stopped abruptly at the entrance to the old quarry. Grace watched him sniff the icy air with renewed intensity. She knew that posture well. He'd found something. "What do you think, boy?" she asked, tightening her scarf against the biting Wisconsin wind. The quarry was only 7 miles from town, but it felt like another world. Abandoned since the 1800s, the site was a maze of tunnels and caverns few locals even remembered. Grace recalled seeing it mentioned in old municipal records, but no one had considered that Bill Thornton might know it intimately. Ranger moved forward with purpose, leading her through a nearly invisible opening between snow-covered rocks. Grace crouched to follow, her knees aching as she squeezed through the narrow gap. The smell of damp earth filled her lungs as they reached a wider chamber. "Oh my God," she whispered, flicking on her flashlight. The beam revealed the unthinkable, a small, makeshift camp. Blankets folded with care, stacks of canned food, and, most disturbing, children's clothing neatly arranged in a wooden crate. Grace recognized the style immediately, pieces identical to those Beth Carter still kept folded at home. Ranger continued sniffing the rocky floor with determination. Grace spotted distinct footprints in the damp soil, large ones, likely a grown man's, and smaller ones beside them. "He was here with them," she murmured, snapping photos with her phone. "And recently." Bill had built a backup refuge, a plan B in case his main hideout was compromised. Crude maps drawn on paper marked alternate entrances and exits to the cave system. A worn Bible rested on a flat stone, its pages underlined with verses about floods and salvation. "You're clever, Bill," Grace muttered as Ranger circled the perimeter. "But not clever enough." Then Ranger barked from deep within the cave. Grace knew instantly. They'd found more than a hideout. They were close. Closer than anyone had imagined. She ignored Sheriff Bradley's orders. Every minute mattered, and Cedar Hollow's red tape would only slow the rescue. With flashlight in hand and Ranger leading the way, Grace pushed deeper into the quarry's narrow tunnels. "Lead the way, buddy," she whispered, as Ranger sniffed the air with laser focus. The uneven, slippery ground made the trek grueling, but Grace didn't slow down. Her joints ached from the cold seeping through the stone walls where icicles shimmered under the flickering light. As they descended into the labyrinth, the silence became almost physical, broken only by dripping water and Ranger's steady breathing. Suddenly, he froze, ears perked. Grace killed the light. In the distance, a soft sound echoed through the stone. A child's song, faint and haunting. A chill ran down her spine. After 4 years of searching, she was finally close. Following the sound with extreme caution, Grace and Ranger entered a natural chamber, expanded by hand. What she saw stole her breath. Bill Thornton had built a sanctuary. 2 small beds with colorful quilts sat against the wall. Makeshift shelves held religious books, children's Bibles, and carefully arranged toys. In the center, a crude altar draped in white cloth held candles, sacred images, and drawings made by the girls. Emma and Lily Carter, now 11, knelt side by side, wearing matching dresses, worn but clean. Their hair, longer than in the missing posters, was braided identically. They sang a hymn in perfect harmony, their voices echoing through the cave. Bill knelt before them, swaying gently, hands raised in prayer. "The Lord protected us from the flood, children. He led us to this ark of salvation," he murmured, lost in his delusion. Grace watched in horror and awe. The girls looked physically healthy, but their eyes told another story, years of isolation and indoctrination. The space, though claustrophobic, was obsessively organized. Food stacked, water stored, and colorful drawings lining the rocky walls. Ranger let out a low growl, signaling the moment had come. Grace took a deep breath, bracing for the confrontation that would change everything. The twins shrank back against the cave wall when they saw Grace. There was no panic, just distant confusion, as if they were seeing a creature from another world. Emma gripped Lily's hand tightly while Lily tilted her head, studying the stranger. "You're safe now," Grace said gently, keeping her distance. "We're here to take you home." The girls exchanged puzzled glances. To them, this was home, the only one they remembered after 4 years underground. The damp cave walls, covered in Bible verses and childhood sketches, were their sanctuary. The outside world, according to Bill's teachings, had been destroyed in a divine flood. "There's nothing left out there," Lily Carter said with startling conviction for a child. "Daddy Bill saved us. We're the only ones who survived." Grace Walker tried to step closer, but each movement made the girls retreat further. Their eyes, though young, held the guarded suspicion of adults. Grace recognized the signs, classic Stockholm Syndrome, just as Dr. Sarah Mitchell had warned during the rescue planning. Then Ranger, silent until now, stepped forward. The German shepherd let out a low bark, more greeting than warning. The sound echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the stone walls. Lily froze. Her eyes widened, locking onto the dog. Something in that bark cracked the mental walls Bill Thornton had built. She let go of her sister's hand and, to everyone's surprise, took a hesitant step toward Ranger. "The Guardian," she whispered, as if revealing a secret. With trembling fingers, Lily reached out and touched the scar along Ranger's flank. The dog remained perfectly still, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. That scar beneath her hand seemed to awaken a memory Bill hadn't been able to erase. "You were in my dreams," Emma said softly, stepping forward for the first time. "The dog who protected us." Grace watched in awe. Ranger was building a bridge she hadn't been able to cross. The girls, who moments ago recoiled from contact, now stroked his fur with familiarity. It was as if some part of them had always known the outside world still existed, preserved in the dreams they shared about the guardian dog. "His name is Ranger," Grace said gently, "and he helped us find you." Lily looked at Grace with new eyes, still wary, but now lit with a flicker of curiosity. The wall was beginning to crumble, not through force, but through the recognition of something familiar in a world they'd been told was gone. The tension in the cave thickened as Grace finally turned to face Bill Thornton. The old pastor, realizing who had entered his sanctuary, tried to rise from his makeshift altar, but something was wrong. His face went pale and he staggered, clutching his chest. "Daddy, are you okay?" Emma cried, rushing to his side as Bill collapsed onto the damp stone floor. Grace stood stunned as the girls sprang into action with eerie precision. Lily ran to a small wooden box while Emma checked his breathing. There was no panic, just practiced efficiency, the kind that revealed years of training. "It's his diabetes," Lily explained, returning with a small kit. "We need the meter and insulin." The twins worked in perfect sync. Emma monitored Bill's vitals while Lily prepared the injection with startling competence for a child. Grace tried to step in, but the girls formed a protective barrier around the unconscious man. "Do you know what you're doing?" Grace asked, watching them administer the medication like professionals. "Daddy Bill taught us," Emma replied, eyes never leaving him. "He said one day he might need us, that we'd be his guardians." Ranger watched from a distance, alert, as if he understood the fragile emotional balance unfolding before him. Bill slowly regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented, until they landed on the girls' faces. A faint smile formed. "My saviors," he murmured. "See how much we need each other? The world out there wouldn't understand." Grace saw it clearly now, the depth of the twisted bond Bill had created. The girls weren't just victims. They'd been turned into caretakers, responsible for the survival of their captor. He had built a mutual dependency that made separation even more complicated. "You did a great job," Grace said softly, trying to build trust. "But now we need to get Bill to real doctors." Lily looked at Emma, then at Bill, uncertain. Grace saw the conflict in their eyes, the loyalty to the man who raised them battling the reality that was beginning to seep into their isolated world. "He'll die if he stays here," Grace added firmly, "and you know that." The girls exchanged a silent glance. Finally, Emma nodded, taking Bill's frail hand in hers. "We'll help him, Daddy," she said, "just like you helped us." Grace watched the twins curled in the corner of the cave, clinging to each other like the world might collapse at any moment. When she reached out, they recoiled again, eyes wide with fear. "The flood will kill us," Lily whispered, voice trembling. "Daddy Bill said we're only safe here." The dilemma tore at Grace's heart. How could she remove the girls without traumatizing them further? They'd spent 4 years believing the outside world was gone. To them, this damp, cold cave was the only refuge that made sense. "We need specialized help," Grace murmured, as Ranger lay down quietly beside the girls, forming a silent bridge of trust. Using her phone's weak signal, she reached Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The child psychologist arrived 2 hours later, escorted by officers to the quarry entrance. Unlike the uniformed men who frightened the girls, Sarah approached calmly, sitting cross-legged on the ground a few feet away. "You must be hungry," she said, opening a small backpack filled with snacks. "I brought something we can share while we talk." For 3 tense hours, Sarah worked to build trust. She didn't challenge the reality Bill had created. Instead, she offered small windows into the outside world. "There's a place where you can be safe and see the sky at the same time. A place where your mom has been waiting for you for a very long time." The mention of Beth Carter stirred confusion in the girls' eyes. To them, their mother was a distant memory, faded by years of isolation. Grace Walker felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. Forcing the girls out could cause irreparable trauma, but leaving them in that cave was unthinkable. Bill Thornton's condition, stable but unconscious, only complicated things further. "They're showing clear signs of Stockholm Syndrome," Dr. Sarah Mitchell whispered to Grace. "The bond with their captor is real and deep. We'll need time and patience." It was Ranger who finally broke the impasse. The German shepherd stepped forward slowly, lying down between the girls and the exit. Lily, captivated by the dog, reached out and touched his fur. Ranger didn't move. He waited. "He's not afraid of the world outside," Grace said softly, "and I promise we'll be with you every step of the way." After hours of delicate negotiation, the twins agreed to leave, but only if they could bring a few belongings and if Ranger walked beside them. That first step out of the cave was just the beginning of a long road to recovery. Snow fell heavily as the group emerged from the caverns. The howl of the wind mixed with the wail of sirens, slicing through the silence of Cedar Hollow. Grace held Lily's hand tightly, while Emma walked beside Ranger, gripping his fur like it was her only tether to reality. In the distance, Beth Carter stood frozen, her pale face framed by a scarf. When the girls finally appeared on the snowy horizon, she raised her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. 4 years of waiting had led to this moment. But Beth hesitated. Her daughters were alive, but the distant look in their eyes and their guarded posture revealed they were no longer the same children who had vanished. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice fragile, testing a word long forgotten. Grace stepped back, allowing mother and daughters to reunite. Ranger remained vigilant beside the girls, as if he understood his role as a bridge between two worlds. Sheriff Tom Bradley watched from afar, visibly uncomfortable. The man who had resisted reopening the case now faced the weight of his own negligence. Around them, townspeople began to gather, offering blankets, hot drinks, and help, the same community that had spent years trying to forget the disappearance. "They'll need time," Dr. Mitchell said, approaching Grace. "The world Bill built for them was all they knew." Grace nodded, the weight of a mission fulfilled, mixing with the storm of emotions inside her. Finding the girls had been her obsession for years. Now that the case was resolved, the emptiness of her own loss resurfaced. Dorothy Henderson, leaning on her cane, approached quietly. "I should have spoken up sooner," she confessed, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "You spoke when it mattered," Grace replied, gently touching her shoulder. As medics prepared the girls for transport to the local hospital, Beth finally embraced her daughters. The contact was awkward, almost formal, like meeting a familiar stranger. In the midst of that tense reunion, Grace watched Bill Thornton being loaded into the ambulance. The former pastor, now a weakened man, cast one final glance at the twins before the doors closed. Snow continued to fall, covering footprints and laying a white blanket over the past. Ranger pressed against Grace's leg, sensing her pain. Together they watched the beginning of a long journey of healing for everyone involved. In the days following the rescue, Ranger became a constant presence in Emma and Lily Carter's lives. The German Shepherd, with his battle scars and steady gaze, seemed to understand their trauma better than most humans. Whenever the girls withdrew during sessions with Dr. Mitchell, Ranger's quiet entrance was enough to ease their shoulders and unlock their voices. Grace watched the transformation with a mix of pride and wonder. He always knew where they were, she told Beth one afternoon as they watched the girls play with Ranger in the snowy backyard. Maybe he sensed something we couldn't. Still wary of the outside world they'd been taught to fear, the girls found safety in Ranger. Lily, the quieter of the two, was the first to give him a new name, Guardian. The nickname stuck, and soon, even the residents of Cedar Hollow called him that. Emma told Dr. Mitchell during one session while stroking Ranger's thick fur, and he doesn't judge us for believing Pastor Bill. Dr. Mitchell noted in her report how the bond with the dog accelerated the girls' reintegration. The dog represents a safe emotional bridge, she wrote. Unlike adults, he brings no explanations, no expectations of who they should be. For Grace, her relationship with Ranger had also deepened. On cold Minnesota nights, when memories of her lost daughter made sleep impossible, Ranger would lie beside her, understanding the shared pain. Grace realized they both carried invisible scars, his from war, hers from grief, and those marks, rather than weakening them, had become their greatest strength. Even Sheriff Bradley, once skeptical of the dog's role, came around. "Maybe we should have a permanent K-9 unit at the station," he admitted during a city council meeting. Dorothy Henderson, the elderly neighbor who first raised suspicions about Bill, began leaving homemade cookies on Grace's porch. "For the four-legged hero," read the note tucked beside the treats. As snow continued to fall over Cedar Hollow, Ranger had become more than a rescue dog. He was a living symbol of how sometimes we need someone who sees beyond the surface to find us when we're lost. The snowfall was gentle that afternoon as Emma and Lily Carter sat quietly on a bench in the town's central park, wrapped in new winter coats. Beth Carter watched her daughters from a few feet away, eyes misty, still adjusting to the reality of having them back after 4 long years. Ranger lay at the girls' feet, ever vigilant. Lily reached out and touched the scar on his ear, a gesture that had become their quiet ritual. "You were there when it was cold," she whispered, her voice soft, her eyes reflecting memories only the two of them shared. The dog responded with a subtle nod, as if to say, "I remember too." From a distance, Grace Walker watched the scene, leaning on her cane. The retired detective had finally found peace after solving the case that nearly consumed her life. Now, instead of case files and reports, she carried a small photo album filled with memories of her own lost daughter, Sarah. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had helped her understand. Saving the Carter twins wouldn't bring Sarah back, but it offered a different kind of healing. The town itself seemed to breathe differently. Neighbors who once avoided Beth now rallied around her family. Dorothy Henderson knitted new gloves to replace the pink one that had led Grace to the truth. Sheriff Tom Bradley, finally owning his mistakes, launched a community watch program to protect local children. Emma, the quieter of the two, pointed to the sky where a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds. "There was no flood," she said softly, still untangling the stories Bill Thornton had planted in her mind. The former pastor, now in custody and receiving psychiatric care, would face justice. Though the girls still asked about him occasionally, Beth held them gently, honoring the space they needed. "Let's go home," she said. "I made hot chocolate." In the distance, the bells of the newly restored Methodist church rang 6 times, echoing across the valley. Ranger stood first, as if he knew it was time to move forward. Grace gave a quiet wave and turned to leave, knowing her mission was complete. The scars would remain, visible on Ranger, invisible on the rest, but now they marked survival, not just pain. In Cedar Hollow, winter would always be harsh, but for the first time in 4 years it carried the promise of spring. And so ends the journey of Grace, Ranger, Emma, and Lily, a reminder that even the longest winters can give way to spring. What would you have done in Grace Walker's place? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Whisker Tales for more stories of courage, healing, and mystery.